CSS Grid Layout. The CSS Grid Layout system offers an easy way of creating good web design layouts on the basis of rows and columns. So you can just float elements around in specific columns and specific rows, and also define the size variations of different columns and rows that you want to have. Let's take a look how this can be played around. Now, in simple words, I've created one div and I've given it a class called grid container. Whereas I've also added some spans inside of it, knowing that span is an inline element which contains text inside it and does not consume the entirety of your width. And div is the box level element, which basically block level element, which basically consumes the entirety of your width, as you can see on the screen over here. Now, to the grid container class, which I have created for this div, I am going to also apply a style known as grid display. So display is set to grid, and the moment I do that, automatically all the items inside of it have started to act like block level elements. And these are moreover to say inline block elements, which consume the entirety of the width that is available over here, and yet I'm calling them inline block elements because you can also decide what sort of width has to be specified to these. Now, at a grid item level, I have not given any special style that makes it behave the way it does. I've just given it a background color, some border to it, a padding, and a text size so it is visible to us in the screen. Now, I'm going to also set in one more property which is known as grid template columns. The grid template is nothing but the exact layout of the grid that you want, and grid template columns is a settings where you can allow a certain width to your columns. Now, for better understanding, I'm going to set it as auto for three columns since I've added three items over here. And you can see it has automatically set equal sizes to all the columns over here, meaning these spans have now been turned into columns in a single row. And since there's accommodation for three columns, it is allowing me to have three. If I remove one in the template and keep just two, it puts two in a row and one in the other row. So meaning there are two columns and two rows. However, there are only two columns filled on the first row and the first column is filled in the second row. Now either you can add more columns over here. Let's do that. And we have, let's say, D over here, which gives us automatic column filling. Now, if I accommodate one more column over here, it has automatically shifted the column having C inside of it to the first row. This is how tables structure work, that is rows and columns, and you can create a structure using how many columns are to be defined. Now remember, this is more of a gameplay with the width of your screen, so you do not define the number of rows as you are giving a freedom of having unlimited rows in this particular case. This is quite ideal when you're trying to display a grid of images in an image gallery, or you can also utilize this in designing the overall layout of a static website, which is very responsive in nature. Now that we have created this option, let's also check out what more properties do we have under the CSS grid. Now that you understood how grid template works, let's also figure out what can be done with grid templates. It's not just about how many columns that you can define, you can also define the sizes of the columns. Now in this example, I've used the auto definition for it to take up the automatic width as available. I can, however, define how much width I want to provide to each column. So let's say the first column I want it to be 100 pixels, the second one I want to be 250 pixels, and the third one is what I want to be as, let's say, 100 pixels again. It automatically takes up the width as defined and is repetitive for all the future columns that are added. So even if I add more items over here, let's say I rename the items inside it, and you see each one of them is following the same pattern for all columns because this is going to act like template columns grid. Now let's also add three more items and look at what more can be done over here. So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I, and the column pattern has repeated. Similar to grid column patterns, we also have grid row patterns. So when you set row template, you can also use the properties that we have utilized for columns. So if I can set a height of, let's say, 200 pixels for the first column, first row, second row, I want it to be 150 pixels, and I'm not giving any property to the third row. You can see that there is no property set to the third row and it has taken the default size for it. But it has definitely set the exact properties that we have created for the first and the second row. What if I happen to give another property to the final row, let's say 50 pixels, and it takes up that. And we see the result is not that soothing. So we can give it a larger row size, let's say 300 pixels, which is a height of 300 pixels. Now, if I happen to repeat another row item once more with some different entries inside it, and you can see that this has taken up the default size because unlike columns, rows can't have a fixed pattern all the time because you are giving unlimited number of rows. You are not limiting yourself over here. So row patterns, you have to be very careful of if it is having a fixed number of rows, you can take up the fixed number of rows, but otherwise it is going to definitely take up the default size that is available to it. To understand further options that are available to us, the first thing I'm going to do is fix this template again. And to do so, I'm going to first change the column sizes grid to auto again, and I'm going to get rid of the row template. So this results in us having a simple table that is having 3 columns and 4 rows. So let's play around with an option known as column gaps. So let's say we have a column gap to be introduced. We can introduce the property column gap, and let's say I give it a gap of 20 pixels. Immediately you see there is a 20 pixel gap drawn between all columns. And since the padding set to my parent div is 20 pixel, this matches with the padding area also, giving it a very aesthetic look. Now let's say the same gap has to be introduced for the rows. There's a simple property known as a row gap. So I've set a row gap of let's say 20 pixels again, and we have a perfectly uniform gap set into rows and columns. This is quite useful when you're trying to create an image grid which has gaps between them. Once you have created column gaps, as you can see on the screen, you have also created these invisible lines between them. So you have column gaps. So starting of this padding space is a line 1, and the space between these two columns is line 2. The space between these two columns here is line 3, and at the end we have line number 4. Same applies for horizontal lines, that is on the rows. So topmost line is created by our padding space is line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, and so on. This gives us a sort of a definition for mapping our rows and columns, and this can be further utilized for a reference point of having sizes set to a certain columns or certain cells. So let's say I apply this style. In my document, I've created one more CSS class which has the settings grid column start and grid column end set to it. So grid column start has been set to 1 and column end has been set to 3. This means the size of that particular grid item is going to be from line number 1 to line number 3. So it is going to take up the space completely for this. And let's apply this style to one of the grid items. Over here, I'm going to apply it. And once I've applied this style to the item which contains the alphabet D inside of it, the span has taken up spaces up to 2 columns, which is line 1, line 2, and line 3. So the space that is consumed between line 1 and line 3. This is how you can make it take up a lot of space. Also, the same setting can be applied for rows. Now let's see how we can do the same for row lines. So let's say we have grid column start. I can also try to apply grid row start. And let's say I give column grid row start from line number 2 because the line visible over here is line number 2 and I want it up to line number 3, 4. So let's go for column row end, grid row end, and that is going to be line number 4. And once I save it, you can see it has taken up the space for the entire 2 columns and 2 rows right here. This is one simple way of manipulating your grid layout, and it's very efficient than having tables. Tables have their own issues sometimes when you use in the basic HTML tables, whereas columns and grids introduced inside grids, columns and rows inside grids is a much better idea for manipulating such layouts.